Trigger warning, this podcast episode openly talks about today's political sphere. If you're sensitive to conversation around today's political opinions, please listen with discretion.
They have proven with sociological studies that people who read the book of Revelation the way we're talking about here, with a speculative approach, correlate very highly with Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism, in many ways, has emerged out of dispensational thinking. Now, Samuel Perry is a graduate of Dallas Seminary, so he knows what he's talking about. He knows that a lot of people who are Christian nationalists love the dispensational scheme of interpretation because America is right. And everybody who's against America, including university professors, okay, they're on the side of the Antichrist. Make America Great Again is the theme of the whore of Babylon in Revelation 18.
Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I'm your curator of conversation, Dr. Tom Rundell. Now, this podcast explores stories, practices, and perspectives for those in the liminal spaces of dark nights and deconstruction. Because the structures that we have built our religious communities upon oftentimes do not have space for our grief, doubts, questions, or mystical experiences. But these are part of being human, so we make space for you here. Today's conversation is with Scot McKnight, the professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary, a history buff of early Christianity, a theology nerd, and a prolific author of almost 40 published books and academic articles. He's delved deep into topics like the historical Jesus, early Christianity, and how to live the Christian life. McKnight is ordained in the Anglican tradition and is theological advisor to Bishop Todd Hunter. And today we explore his most recent book, Revelation for the Rest of Us. We delve into his history in fundamentalism, conversion to Anglicanism, theological explorations, the book of Revelation, political imagination, and some more things too. It is a conversation to stretch your mind beyond the borders of standard American theology of, quote-unquote, the end times. There are some academic words to keep in mind as you listen today. Not all my listeners will be familiar with the terms as much as the concepts, because Western evangelicalism has been shaped by a theology that rose up in the early 20th century called Dispensationalism. It's a big word that means that God's actions towards humans has been different according to whatever dispensation or snippet of human history that the story is found within. Now, these folks believe that we are in the final dispensation, which will bring about the close of history with the return of Christ. Popularized theology of the late 20th century started to speculate what this was going to look like, when it was going to take place, and they used the book of Revelation as their guide. If they could only decode that book properly, they could understand when Christ would return to establish the kingdom of God and eradicate evil. Scott's book says this is an improper use of the book of Revelation and gives us another way, which leads us to become what he calls a dissident disciple, living countercultural within the empire according to the way of Christ. So I'm going to set you loose on this episode of the Liminal Living Podcast with Scot McKnight. All right, well, Scot, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I see that you have a lovely backdrop of lots and lots of books. Where do you find yourself right now? Is this your office?
I have a library in the basement of our home. Yeah, I don't go to my office very often.
Aha.
We don't have any students on campus. So I'm downstairs. Yeah, this is my library.
I like it. I see some pretty cool books right behind you also.
Yeah.
Place called Tov, the church called Tov, Pivot. Also, yeah, I get nice display.
Yeah, well, thanks. My publisher wants me to have those books in the background, but some places they show up backwards, and I don't understand quite how that happens. But
well, I've made them known for our audio listeners. Yes. But so my first introduction to you was. I was given your book Blue Parakeet by someone that may have been 2000, I would say 2009, I think it was. It was back in the day, and they handed me Blue Parakeet. And I gotta say, what I really appreciated about that work was that you really dove into like the Bible study nerd aspect of things for like even in the evangelical tradition. and then you kind of wrap it all. You've got us hooked. And then at the end, and this is why I believe women should be in ministry. And my mind was just blown. I didn't know you were going to take us there in that book, but I just love that moment because it was such a beautiful surprise where, like, the church I was in, they were actually fighting over that issue, and it was very divisive. And I was on the let's get women in ministry and in leadership, and the majority of the people were not. And so to read your book and that moment of my life was just so it was just so helpful. So you've always had a place in my heart. So,
well, thanks. The editor wanted me to do 4 topics and not 1. So I did women, but I mean, he wanted me to do atonement, gospel, and kingdom, and women in ministry. And I decided to do women in ministry first. And by the time I was done, I wrote the editor. I said, this book will be way too long if I do all 4 of these. So he said, okay, just stay there. Well, it's nice because that book has been very helpful and encouraging for women who feel like their voices have been silenced. And it's helped people maybe like you and others around you who needed that kind of message at that time. So it's good. Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're writing in that book. You have like these instinctual understandings sometimes, and then an author comes along and gives you the words for that instinct. And that's what your book in that moment did for me. Was
very good. Thank you.
Then I had words and understanding, and then that gave me confidence to then stand up for women in ministry. And I eventually left that church over that issue, but that's long history past now. But you gave words to that instinctual part of me, and then that gave me confidence to really know who I was. So
I'm encouraged.
Well, I really don't know a whole lot. I know your works, and I know a lot of the things you know because you've written them down. But I was wondering if you could introduce us to who you are. What's the soil that your life has grown out of?
My newest book, Pivot, talks about soil quite a bit.
Oh, does it?
It's an interesting image you've chosen.
I love that one.
Well, I mean, I'm almost 70 years old. What's today? 2 more days. 2 more days, and I turned 70.
Well, happy birthday.
Well, thank you. My wife and I grew up in Northwest Illinois in a farming community called Freeport. And my parents were Baptist fundamentalists, not polemical types, but we went to a conservative church. And my father was a public school teacher in English, and he was a coach. So, and this is part of the soil of my life. When grade school was over, I did not go home. I went to the high school, and I had a locker in the coach's locker room where if it was football season, I went to the football field. And if it was basketball season, I went to the gymnasium. And if it was track and field season, I went to the track. So I was nurtured to be an athlete by my father and my family. And one of my heroes when I was a young boy was my now wife's older brother, Ronnie Norman.
Really?
He was a great basketball player, played at the University of Iowa. So that was a big part of my life. And then when I went to church all the time, but when I was 17 years old, I was at a church camp and had a spiritual experience of surrendering my life to God. It wasn't Jesus at the time, I have to tell you. It was a spirit, let's say a spirit-soaked understanding of God and the community and the Bible, etc. And from that point on in my life, Tom, that very moment, I wanted to study the Bible, came home from camp, and I was reading the Bible every morning. I got up at 4:30 and read the Bible for an hour and a half. and then went to some kind of practice, cross country or basketball. And then I decided when I was in high school that I wanted to go to a Christian college and not go to a school, university, to compete in track and field. So I surrendered my life to Jesus Christ and wanted to be a Bible student. Went to college, and all I did was study. Well, I played basketball, but it was a small college. And then I went to seminary. Then I did a PhD, and I've been doing what I've been doing since 1971, the fall of 1971. So that's 52 years, about this time. I was beginning, I remember it was just as fall came along that I went to our local Christian bookstore and I bought a commentary on Galatians by William Hendrickson for $2.95. And I read that commentary, every page, every line, while I was in high school. Taught myself Greek in high school a little bit. Didn't know much what I was doing. So that's sort of what I've done. And Chris and I got married when I was a sophomore, when we were sophomores in college. We have 2 children and 2 grandchildren. And we've been faithful following Christ with one another, going to church, raising our children in the faith. They go to church. Our grandchildren go to church. So that's sort of me. That's the soil.
Something stood out to me. You said you taught yourself Greek in high school, and I gotta say I did the same thing.
Did you really?
I was like, no one else is this weird. It must have been just me. So it's good to hear. I would open up my Strong's commentary, and I was like, I want to know what this says. I know the English part. Yeah. And so I taught myself the Greek alphabet. And then when I would go to church, I would take notes, but I would substitute the English letters for the Greek letters so that I could learn how to read it and write it and pronounce it. And then I learned, by the time I got to college, I took Greek class and I learned more vocabulary on it. But man, my friends thought I was so weird doing that. So I thought,
both of us were weird.
We were weird in a good way. So
yeah.
Now, what kind of faith roots did that look like? You said you had like a fundamentalist Baptist upbringing, but then you had a moment when you had your moment of surrender. What did your faith look like at that point?
Well, it's going way back in time, but I was at a church camp in Muscatine, Iowa, and they were talking about the Bird Book with Campus Crusade, if you know what that is.
I don't know the Bird Book.
They had the 4 spiritual laws.
Yeah, I know that one.
And then they had what they call the Bird Book, and the Bird Book was about surrendering your life to the Spirit. It wasn't charismatic, of course, but it got close. And I was at a church camp that emphasized that, and they were saying that if you confess your sins and then invite the Spirit to come into your life, this is bad theology at a technical level, but it's experientially valuable. Then you invite the Holy Spirit into your life, and the Spirit will come because you've made space for the Spirit by confessing your sins. If you're indwelt by the Spirit, you can't invite the Spirit in, but it was more of a filling of the Spirit.
Gotcha.
So I did this before breakfast one morning, and it was a dynamic religious spiritual experience for me. Completely transformative. From that moment on, I could still see the tree. I could see the cheap little theater that they had made out of wood benches on a hillside and the fire pit at the bottom. And so my high school experience was deeply embracive of the significance of the Holy Spirit in life. So I was very much a person who, when I sat down to read the Bible, I prayed that the Spirit would open my mind and heart to whatever I needed to hear. But I was also very biblical, and our church was fundamentalist. My youth pastor was fundamentalist and very biblicistic. So everything had to be proven by the Bible. Mm-hmm. And if you couldn't prove it from the Bible, it wasn't worth your time. Mm-hmm. It was that sort of thing. So I became a student of the Bible. And I like to think that my religious discipleship, spiritual discipleship at the time was a spirit-intoxicated biblical faith. And I did things that my pastor asked. There was 7 booklets by Campus Crusade, and I went through all 7 of those. Chris did as well, and we discussed them. And that was the sort of experience I had. When I went to college, of course, I began to study the Bible more technically, and so I deepened my knowledge of the Bible with a more sophisticated method. I don't think the method that I learned in college was sufficiently rigorous and historical as it is for me today, but it was a Bible-based, spirit-shaped form of fundamentalism. And we didn't even use the word evangelical at the time.
Yeah. Now, was there a moment where that kind of shifted for you? Was it during studies? I believe you're currently, did you end up in the Anglican tradition?
Yeah.
So how do you go from kind of fundamentalist, charismatic Baptist into Anglicanism? What's that journey look like?
I would never consider myself charismatic. I mean, I wanted to be, but which meant I wanted to speak in tongues. But it was spirit shaped. But it was too biblicistic to be too spiritual. Okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, when I was doing my PhD, so after college, I went to seminary. We had our children at that time, and then we moved to Nottingham, England, where I did a PhD with James D.G. Dunn at the University of Nottingham. And when we were there, our first year, we went to a local Church of England, Anglican church, and just loved it. I loved the prayers, the Book of Common Prayer, the orderliness of the service, and we had a wonderful Bible. He was an evangelical Anglican pastor named John Corey, and he's I think he's retired now, but he was a professor of missiology eventually in Bristol, England. Wonderful man, his wife Elizabeth. So it was Anglicanism for me was very comfortable with evangelicalism. And of course, one of my heroes at the time was John R.W. Stott, who was a Church of England Anglican evangelical leader. And I read all his books at the time. So when we came back to the United States, we were in a free church for quite a while. Then we attended Willow Creek, and after let's say 20 years of the free church, and I'm just guessing on numbers there, and Willow Creek, we realized that Willow Creek was too far from our house because the traffic patterns had so shifted that it took forever. I one time went down to speak on a Wednesday night. It took me an hour and 45 minutes to get there.
Wow.
And I said to Chris, I just can't do this. And it's just nothing but traffic. And so we changed churches, and Chris at the time said, why don't we look into an Anglican church? And I looked sort of at a couple churches in the area, and I said, well, here's one not too far from our home. It's not close, but it wasn't too far. I said, we can try that. And we went, and we've never left.
How long have you been there now?
And then I was invited by some leaders in the Anglican Church of North America, which is, you may know, a breakoff from the Episcopalian Church. And I was invited to become a deacon, ordained, and asked if I wanted to be a priest. And I said, no, I don't see myself being a priest. I'm a professor. And so then I was asked to be a canon theologian for my bishop named Todd Hunter. So, and that means that I'm a theological advisor.
I love what Todd's doing.
That's all canon means.
Yeah, I love what Todd Hunter's doing. And,
yeah, I do too. He's very spirit. He was in the Vineyard. He was the president of the Vineyard for a while. Mm-hmm. He's very charismatic.
Now, some definition of terms might be helpful. The rapture is the moment Christ returns to the earth for his true followers. Dispensational belief says that humans will disappear in mass to join Christ in the clouds, leaving the rest of the earth behind to face God's judgment. There are three views as to when this will take place within dispensationalism: pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib, short for tribulation, which is a period of 7 years where the judgments of the book of Revelation are experienced on earth while under the rule of some antichrist political figure who's the embodiment of Satan in some form and rules from a single government organization. The rapture will either take away the followers of Christ before the tribulation, in the middle of the tribulation, or after the tribulation is done. And after this comes the millennial reign of Christ, where he abolishes evil, sits on a throne for a period of 1,000 years of peace, after which comes the battle of Armageddon, when Satan gathers all the evil people for one more all-out brawl against Christ and the people who are his true believers. Eventually he loses, and everyone who followed him are thrown into a lake of fire for the rest of eternity. That is the basic and simplified terms and timelines of this view. Other terms you'll want to be familiar with is amillennial. It's a form of thinking that says the 1,000-year reign of Christ is metaphorical, and Christ is currently ruling on earth through the presence of the church. And this is counter to dispensationalism. Often accompanying this view is something called preterism, that says all of or most of the events of Revelation have been fulfilled already in the fall of Rome. The Antichrist was Nero or Domitian, the Caesars at the time. And the tribulation was the persecution of the early church, and so on. And that is also counter to dispensationalism. You just released this book, Revelation for the Rest of Us. And I gotta admit that I grew up in that fundamentalist, but from a charismatic perspective, where you're really into that dispensational, left behind, Hal Lindsey, that whole thing. I grew up in that, and I would. There was a time when I was 8 years old, and I came home for lunch from school, and I was expecting to see my mom and
I know
my
what
kids
you're going to
there.
say.
You know exactly where this is going. I'll finish for my listeners, but I walk in, the tea kettle's boiling, and my mom had happened to run next door, but I didn't know that. But I had so much fear in me all the time because Jesus was about to come back. I thought the rapture happened and I missed it. And we grew up watching Jack Van Impe and Hagee and all these people predicting and reading Revelation with the newspaper right here and say, oh, see, this news article is what they talked about in Revelation. And I remember thinking, I didn't know how to question it, as a very young child. I didn't know how to question it, but I had this hunch, that I wonder how many times he's used that scripture to explain a news article. Does it change? Does it shift? So that's what I grew up in. And reading, your introduction to the book, I'm like, oh, he's coming from the same waters, that fundamentalist dispensational understanding of God's about to come back and it's going to be horrible. Why did you choose to write this book, and why right now?
I one time was at home. I was in the driveway hurdling. I created some hurdles, so I was running a hurdle race. It wasn't very long, 20 yards. And it got later and later and later. And my parents and my two sisters were at church. And I was convinced the rapture had come because the neighbors who were also in our church had not come back yet either. It was getting darker and darker. And I finally went inside pretty scared about what was going on. So I know that experience. And Tom, I've met many people who've had a similar experience as a child, scared the rapture had come. Okay. I was interested in the book of Revelation in high school and in college, very interested. And I read Salem Kurban, not Hal Lindsey. I've never read Hal Lindsey's book because Salem Kurban did everything Hal Lindsey did in his book called Guide to Survival. It's for people who don't get raptured. Oh. And it's a book for them to know how to survive during the tribulation.
Okay. I did not.
And I never read his book 666 or anything else. And then when I was in college, so I read that book and I knew that interpretation because it was so clear and compelling and it told the whole story and made sense. When I was in college, I began to read other viewpoints. And a decisive moment for me occurred when Robert Gundry's book, The Church in the Tribulation, came out from Zondervan. I was in Zondervan the day the books arrived at the bookstore, and I bought a copy, and I read it very carefully. And he persuaded me of a post-trib rapture. And persuade is in the sense that I knew that he was right, but emotionally, I wasn't quite ready to go there. And I know intellectually, I was not skilled enough yet to understand what that meant. But I read it and it convinced me. And then I read other books and I became post-trib. My pastor thought I was a liberal, but he still let me be a youth pastor.
Just for that one thing? Wow. How would that... How would that make you?
Had nothing. It was because I questioned pre-trib rapture, which it was a package. Because then, if you're questioning that, what else are you going to question next?
Yeah. Slippery slope.
And then he wondered if I was going to become a millennial, because that was on the slippery slope down. And at that time, Anthony Hoekema was teaching at Calvin College or at the seminary, and I knew of his stuff. Then he wrote a book on the Bible in the future. I still have that book. But here's what happened to me, Tom. I got so tired of the dispensational squabbles about the rapture and the debates between Christians, and I knew some of my favorite Christians didn't believe anything like pre-trib rapture. They were amillennialists of a different sort, and I valued their writings more than other people's writings. So I then went to seminary. When I was in seminary, I was doing New Testament studies, and this was just not an issue for anything other than an occasional moment in a class when someone would ask a question. And so by the time I finished seminary, I had put the eschatological discussions behind me. And when I went to do my PhD, I read Jewish texts like crazy. For a year, I did nothing but read what we called at that time background studies. And I read all the Jewish pseudepigrapha that were in print at the time. We now have even more in print. And I became just convinced that the book of Revelation is like Jewish apocalyptic literature, and it should be read the way we read those writings, rather than as, let's say, precise prophetic predictions of whether Vladimir Putin is the Antichrist. I wasn't to read it like that. It was a contextually driven way of talking about the battle of good and evil and the victory of God over Satan and injustice, etc., and the establishment of the kingdom of God, or peace, or justice, or New Jerusalem, however you want to describe it. So that's what happened to me. And then I started teaching in the Gospels, and I would have one lecture for 12 years when I was teaching at Trinity, where I would talk about Matthew 24. And I was at the, I would just say that I provided a preterist reading of Matthew 24, that I said this was about 70 AD. Tom Wright's book, Jesus and the Victory of God, came out toward the end of my time teaching at Trinity. And he completely blew away that dispensational reading with his more preterist type reading. I think I would classify it that way. Tom's always very difficult to classify because he doesn't play the game with those categories.
Yeah.
He does something else. He's doing history. And then I went to teach undergraduates for 17 years. I left Trinity, went to North Park University. And while I was there, I just didn't talk about these things, except I would give one lecture in a survey of the Bible class on Revelation, and I gave the basic viewpoints type thing. And all the while, I was reading Jewish apocalyptic literature. I was paying attention to some scholarship on the book of Revelation, and my mind had changed. So just a few years ago, a student of mine in the doctoral program named Greg Mamula asked me if I would teach a course on the book of Revelation for our cohort. And I said, I would love to do it, but I don't have time to prepare that class for that next class that we would teach. I would teach that. So I'm going to have to just say I can't do it. But a couple of years after that, I had a hole in my schedule for the fall. And I just said, it's time to try to put together what I'm thinking about Book of Revelation. Well, at that time, I had an amazing young graduate assistant by the name of Cody Matchett. And he was so skilled and developed as a thinker. And he asked me what I was going to work on. I said, I'd like to work on the Book of Revelation. He says, I'd love to work with you. So we began preparing lectures for a class. And I would say, Cody, do this, and I'll do this, and tell me what so-and-so believes, and I'll tell you what this guy believes. So we were working together, and the lectures started to come together, and I would outline them, send them to Cody. He'd make suggestions. And then about halfway through the class, I said, Cody, we've got a book here. Mm. And I said, I'd love for you to work with me on this book. And when the class was over, I started writing early December before the class was actually over, because the lectures were all ready. So I started writing, and I'd say by the end of January, I was kicking out chapters and sending them to him, and we were going back and forth. And I talked to an editor at Zondervan. I said, what do you think? He said, we'd love to have this book. So we got a contract, and I think I'm not quite sure when the book actually, I think we got him the book by the end of the summer or the beginning of the fall of the next year. And we worked quite a bit with editing suggestions and all this sort of thing. And editors change, and it gets kind of messed up with the publishers. And so we published Revelation for the Rest of Us, which rhymes with Festivus for the rest of us. And it's done really well. It's been really fun. And, I'm sure there's a lot of people who disagree with me, or us, but we'll just not going to spend our time arguing with them. We'll just keep saying what we think, and people get to make up their mind.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be really helpful. One of the distinctions that you made in the book was that you wanted to take readers from a place of speculation about future events to an imagination. Would you like to talk a little bit about the difference between that speculation versus imagination? That really just caught my attention.
I think you're the first person who's actually said this, to move from speculation to imagination. That's pretty clever, because that's a pretty good way of reading what actually happened. Is speculation reading of the book of Revelation looks at every passage and sees it as a prediction of something in the future, something specific, and it reads the book of Revelation asking who in the modern world is doing what in the book of Revelation. And if they line up with all the stars in the proper order, then we have identification of the fulfillment of the prophecies of the book of Revelation. So we're asking about who's the Antichrist, who's the false prophet, has the tribulation started, questions like this all the time. Who is 666? Who fits the number 666, etc. So it was, that's the speculation approach. And frankly, Tom, America is engulfed in this. Mm-hmm. Whether a person knows it or not, whether they are dispensational or not, and modern day dispensationalists, a guy like Darrell Bach at Dallas Seminary, I would not call a speculative approach at all. So it's sort of classic dispensationalism, old-fashioned dispensationalism, populist dispensationalism that is like this. The progressive dispensationalism of Blasing and Bach is not like this. So I'm not critical of them, even though I say, Dallas, we've got a problem. My Dallas students, I have 4 of them right now. They really think that's funny.
So I'm with them. That's hilarious.
But the imagination approach says the book of Revelation is John seeing things, hearing things, and whether John actually saw something on a screen or a wall in his wherever he lived, or whether this is something that is more in his brain, does not matter to me. But both of those, for me, are about the imagination. Is that John saw something that stimulated his thinking, so that when he wrote, what he saw, he described it in terms of things in the Old Testament. Now, John can be said to allude to the Old Testament over 300 times without hardly ever quoting it. Some people think he never really does quote the Old Testament. So John's mind was so saturated with the prophetic writings of the Old Testament that when he wrote out his visions, what he heard, what he saw, his language was in the scripture. And he uses images to stimulate the imagination of those who hear it. This text of Revelation would have been read by someone in each of the 7 churches. And if in some of those cities, Ephesus, say, Sardis, say, had more than one house church, the book would have been read aloud more than one time. And the people who were sitting there would have heard this. And you cannot read Revelation 12 about the woman and not visualize what is being said. The dragon, the tail, the stars, the woman with the crown, the woman running, the waters trying to, kill her, all these sorts of things. She's, you can't read that without visualizing it. That's the imagination. That's what John is trying to do. But at the same time that his imagination is stimulated and the readers or the listeners' imagination is stimulated, we are stimulated to, in a sense, apply or to envision how this text works in our world as well. Because when you read Revelation 17 through 19 about Babylon, the whore of Babylon, you cannot but think, if you're thoughtful, you cannot but think that there are traits of Babylon, Rome, in the 1st century that are not unlike countries in the world today, including the United States. And so it becomes a template for evaluating and discerning political corruption that works against the way of the Lamb in our world today. So that is my long-winded answer to the difference between speculation and imagination.
Yeah, and I really like how you pointed out that the speculation always seems to have like this: America is the hero. At the end of the line, America's always the hero, and the bad guys are always going to be somewhere else, and we're going to be here. And I kind of put it together that this speculative dispensational understanding of Revelation actually props up like this Christian nationalism that we're seeing. Do you think the two are just side-by-side buddies, or do you think they're kind of tied together and one is feeding the other?
Yeah, you're trying to get yourself in trouble here.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay. All right, here's the thing. Israel is the hero in the dispensational paradigm. The rebirth of the state of Israel in 1948 is seen as biblical prophecy fulfilled. And originally that was 1948, and it was connected to the fig tree of Matthew 24, and that was one generation there would be the rapture. And since that didn't occur in 1978 or by 1988, we're in big trouble. And so that's all changed. But still, the rebirth of Israel is seen as a promise. Now, anybody who wants to be on God's side must side with Israel. The state of Israel today, since the United States sides with Israel, the United States is on the winning team. So, yes, America comes up gold in this the speculative interpretation. And America's enemies are God's enemies, and they are the enemies of Israel, and they are on the side of the Antichrist. So Russia especially is connected to and has been connected to this interpretation, but also the European Union has been connected to this interpretation. And you may remember this from Hal Lindsey, where this sort of thing was very important. But you asked a very interesting question about Christian nationalism. And the studies by Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry, along with Andrew Whitehead in the United States, these are important thinkers about Christian nationalism today. They have proven with sociological studies that people who read the book of Revelation the way we're talking about here, with a speculative approach, correlate very highly with Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism, in many ways, has emerged out of dispensational thinking.
Wow, I'd never saw that before.
Yeah, there is a correlation between dispensationalism and Christian nationalism. Now, Samuel Perry is a graduate of Dallas Seminary, so he knows what he's talking about. And I don't know what he believes personally, but he knows that a lot of people who are Christian nationalists love the dispensational scheme of interpretation because America is right. And everybody who's against America, including university professors, okay, that sort of thing,
yeah,
they're on the side of the Antichrist. So Christian nationalism has cosmic divine sanction to it.
Wow.
All right, that's my answer.
My brain is blowing up.
I think I have a footnote in the book on this.
Yeah, my brain is a little, there's explosions going on here. And where you're saying that the point of Revelation is to create dissident disciples that stand up against the empire, which is Babylon is the template for empire. And yet we have reversed that to be now empire is what God has ordained, and anyone who dissidents, like European Union or whatever. It seems like that whole understanding is flipped for the dispensationalists for what the intent was to create a dissident disciple against the abuses of the Babylons and the empires. Am I making that connection correct?
Oh yeah, you're right, and it's an important point. But I think they would say, and I want to interpret them fairly. I think they would say that there's more than one sort of political government in the world. There's more than one empire. There's an evil empire and a good empire, and we want to be on the good empire because that's God's team, and we need to be on God's team. So Israel and the United States, in other words, classic democracies is what people call it, or Republican, democratic republics. They are the true people of God. They are on God's side. They are on Israel's side. And the socialists, the democratic socialists, the socialists, and the communists are all against that. So there is such an incredible correlation between political orientation and political position and who's going to win in the tribulation that you have to come out saying, this smells like a skunk. This sounds too much like politics and not enough like Bible. Because what the book of Revelation does is it teaches us not to be allegiant to any empire, only the empire of God, which is a transnational spiritual empire that takes place embodied form in the church. The people of God are to be allegiant to the Lamb, to Jesus Christ, and to him alone. And therefore, they should not be swearing allegiance to any nation, because any nation can lose its way and get corrupted. So, but yeah, that's my answer.
Wow. Now, how would you characterize a dissident disciple? What does that look like?
Well, in chapters 17 through 19, John provides for us a map of political corruption, a template. And we list 7 characteristics. It's idolatrous, it's opulent, so the luxury of the woman. It persecutes the followers of Jesus. Image and branding are significant. Everywhere you go, you see the signs of the presence of Rome and Babylon. Militarism is its way of gaining victory. It's domination rather than persuasion. It's economically exploitative. The passage in Revelation 18 about all the cargo that's being shipped to Rome is really quite a sketch of what was going on in trade in the first century. And then the ultimate characteristic is it's arrogant. So if you'd like me to make a slightly political statement, this is how a dissident reacts, is Make America Great Again is the theme of the whore of Babylon in Revelation 18.
Man, you went there and I'm happy.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that sense of domination, that sense of pride and arrogance that we are the greatest nation in the history of the world. I grew up thinking this. It wasn't ingrained, it wasn't pounded into my head. But I remember living in England in my PhD days, meeting a young man, 6th form or something, so almost university student, who was very critical of the United States. And I think it was the first time I ever met anyone who was that vitriolic, seeing the United States as evil. And it was in part because of the wars, the OPEC controversies of oil in the Middle East. And he just despised Ronald Reagan. And of course, in the evangelical world in the United States, Ronald Reagan was a hero. So it was kind of stunning, but at the same time, he made me alert to the fact that there are critics of the United States that need to be listened to. And I've been a political dissident of all political parties since that time.
Now, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in our world, and there was a recent rapture. We missed it again. I think it was just here September or October. It was in October 23rd. I think we missed another rapture.
Really? Yeah. I hadn't heard that one.
That one made its ways around social media, but there was someone online who was connecting. It was a YouTube thing that connecting dots that was there. But there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, which then these folks who interpret speculatively grab hold of. And while I don't use the book of Revelation that way, you don't use the book of Revelation that way, it's still really easy to get discouraged as you're looking at the world, because it's almost like they can use that speculative approach to kind of fend off the despair of what's going on in the world and say, well, God's about to enter and fix everything.
Mm-hmm.
And how does one then gain their hope in the world as it is with that imaginative approach to Revelation? Does the book of Revelation give us that picture of hope in the midst of things blowing up around us?
Yes, it does. And that's the entire purpose of the book. But if we are looking at modern events and what's going on in Israel right now between the Palestinians, Hamas, and the state of Israel is really bad. It's like cosmic warfare that we can watch online on TV. I believe that what's going on in Israel today has absolutely nothing to do with the book of Revelation. But what the book of Revelation does is it says to us, this is the way the Lamb operates, and this is the way Babylon operates. And so I think we need to look at the television and what's going on with Netanyahu just blasting away at Gaza, and what's going on in northern Israel with Hezbollah. I think we need to ask the questions, not should we be behind Israel or should we be behind Palestinians, or can there be any justification for Hamas and Hezbollah? I don't think that's the way to approach these. I think the question to ask is, how do these behaviors of Israel, of Hamas, of Hezbollah, and of the Palestinians line up or contrast with the way of Jesus in the book of Revelation? And I think the answer to that question is they're all wrong. A pox on all of them. Allegiance to Israel right now, we might say, is better than to Hamas. But none of it is the way of the Lamb. And the Lamb wins not by slaughtering people with military victories. The Lamb wins with a sword that comes out of its mouth. The word of God as the truth of God. The gospel is the way the Lamb operates. So while we might take some positions on particular activities in Israel right now, we should not swear allegiance to any of the governmental or anarchist governments or anarchist groups involved. So it provides for us, the book of Revelation, that God is going to enter this world and tear apart evil, and God someday will establish New Jerusalem, and we need to be looking toward New Jerusalem. And the more we look toward New Jerusalem, we will see Babylon for what it is, and we will strive for New Jerusalem, not Babylon.
Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap up the podcast than with those words there. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts and sharing this work. Where would you direct people who are interested in looking at more of your works in this book specifically?
Well, Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy books. I have plenty of books out there. And I also have social media. I'm on Twitter, Scot McKnight, on T and Scott. I have Threads. I have Instagram. And I have a Substack, which is sort of where I produce something every day of the week, and have been doing since 2004.
Oh, wow.
But it's not always been on Substack. Yeah. So that's where they can find me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being generous with your time and coming on our podcast and talking with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be with you and good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Liminal Living podcast. This was a fun conversation, and I know some of you might be thinking, where do I stand on these issues? And honest answer, I have no idea. I really don't hold to the dispensational view any longer. I grew up in that. I've long left it behind. I do hold some kind of a preterist interpretation of Revelation, that I do believe that most of those events have been fulfilled with the fall of Rome. I'm unsure about my belief around the second coming of Christ and what that would look like. I've got a lot of unanswered questions that I didn't really have time to talk with Scott about today, but perhaps in future episodes we'll explore them. Some of my questions would be, how does a post-Copernican world understand end times theology? That is, the theological imagination that wrote these theologies comes from a world in medieval times which believed the earth was the center of the universe and humans were at the center of it all. And Copernicus said that the sun was the center of the universe and rotated around it. Cosmology has made some significant advancements in the last 100 years alone, showing us that our galaxy is just one in an almost infinite amount in the universe. What happens to our understanding of God's rule being established on Earth when there might be infinite amounts of sentient life across the universe and possible galaxy? I don't know. What happens to our theology if we discover multidimensional realities? With the discovery of quantum physics, these are not science fiction ideas, but unfolding concepts. And we're still trying to catch up from the Darwinian revolution, which scientifically explained how life came about on Earth. What does an eschatology, or end times understanding, look like that takes all of these things into account, and things as they keep unfolding? I really don't know, but I'm going to continue exploring these concepts with you all. And that is why this is liminal living, because I live in that place between knowing and not knowing, remaining curious, not arriving at certainty, and making peace with the tension of that. And we will see you next week for another episode of the Liminal Living Podcast. Thanks for listening.